Hello, friends. Welcome back to the Kettle Park Chapter a Day Book Club. Again, we are reading The Call of the Wild by Jack London from 1903. Today we have Chapter 2, The Law of the Club and Fang. So Kettle, park yourself somewhere comfortable and enjoy the reading. Buck's first day at Daya Beach was like a nightmare. Every hour was filled with shock and surprise. He had suddenly jerked from the heart of civilization and flung into the heart of things primordial. No lazy, sun-kissed life was this, with nothing to do but loaf and be bored. Here was neither peace, nor rest, nor a moment's safety. All was confusion and action. In every moment, life and limb were in peril. There was imperative need to be constantly alert, for these dogs and men were not town dogs and men. They were savages, all of them, who knew no law but the law of the club and fang. He had never seen dogs fight as these wolfish creatures fought, and his first experience taught him an unforgettable lesson. It is true, it was a voracious experience, else he would not have lived to profit by it. Curly was the victim. They were camped near the log store where she, in her friendly way, made advances to a husky dog the size of a full-grown wolf, though not half so large as she. There was no warning, only a leap like a flash and a metallic clip of teeth, a leap out of equally swift, and Curly's face was ripped open from eye to jaw. It was the wolf manner of fighting, to strike and leap away, but there was more to it than this. 30 or 40 huskies ran to the spot and surrounded the combatants in an intent and silent circle. Buck did not comprehend that silent intentness, nor the eager way with which they were licking their chops. Curly rushed her antagonist, who struck her and leaped aside. He met her next rush with his chest in a particular fashion that tumbled her off her feet. She never regained them. This was what the onlooking huskies had waited for. They closed in upon her, snarling and yelping, and she buried, screaming with agony, beneath the bristling mass of bodies. So sudden was it and so unexpected that Buck was taken aback. He saw spits run out of his scarlet tongue in a way he had of laughing, and he saw Francis, swinging an axe, spring into the mess of dogs. 3 men with clubs were helping him to scatter them. It did not take long. 2 minutes from the time Curly went down, the last of her assailants were clubbed off, but she lay there limp and lifeless in a bloody trampled snow, almost literally torn to pieces. The swat half-breed standing over her was cursing horribly. The scene often came back to Buck to trouble him in his sleep. So that was the way, no fair play. Once down, that was the end of you. Well, he would see to it that he would never go down. Spritz ran out his tongue and laughed again, and from that moment Buck hated him with bitter and deathless hatred. Before he had recovered from the shock caused by the tragic passing of Curly, he received another shock. Francis fastened him upon an arrangement of straps and buckles. It was a harness, such as he had seen the grooms put on the horses at home. And as he had seen horses work, so he was set to work, hauling Francis on the sled to the forest that fringed the valley, and returning with a load of firewood. Though his dignity was sorely hurt by thus being made a draught animal, he was too wise to rebel. He buckled down with the will and did his best, though it was all new and strange. Francis was stern, demanding instant obedience, and by virtue of his whip receiving instant obedience, while Dave, who was an experienced wheeler, nipped Buck's hind quarters whenever he was in error. Spitz was the leader, likewise experienced, and while he could not always get at Buck, he growled sharp reproof now and again, or cunningly threw his weight in the traces to jerk Buck into a way he should go. Buck learned easily, and under the combined tuition of his 2 mates and Francis, made remarkable progress. Ere they returned to camp, he knew enough to stop at hoe and to go ahead at mush, to swing wide on the bends and to keep clear of the wheeler when the loaded sled shot downhill at their heels. "To revere good dogs," Francis told Perlot. "Dat Buck him pull like hell. I teach him quick in anything." By afternoon, Perlot, who was in a hurry to be in the trail with his dispatches, returned to the 2 more dogs. Billy and Joe, he called them, 2 brothers and true huskies both. Sons of one mother though they were different as day and night. Billy's one fault was his excessive good nature, while Joe was very opposite, sour and introspective. With a perpetual snarl and a malignant eye, Buck received them in camaraderie fashion. Dave ignored them. While Spitz proceeded to thrash first one and then the other, Billy wagged his tail appeasingly, turned to run when he saw that the appeasement was of no avail, and cried, still appeasingly, when Spitz's sharp teeth scored his flank. But no matter how Spitz circled, Joe whirled around on his heels to face him, mane bristling, ears laid back, lips writhing and snarling, jaws clipping together as fast as he could snap, and eyes diabolically gleaming. The incarnation of the belligerent fear. So terrible was his appearance that Spitz was forced to forego disciplining him. But to cover his own discomfort, he turned upon the inoffensive and wailing Billy and drove him to the confines of the camp. By evening, Perlot secured another dog, an old husky, long and lean and gaunt, with a battle-scarred face and a single eye with flashed of warning and prowess that commanded respect. He was called Solex, which means the angry one. Like Dave, he said nothing, gave nothing, and expected nothing. And when he marched slowly and deliberately into their midst, even Spitz left him alone. He had one peculiarity which Buck was unlikely enough to discover. He did not like to be approached on his blind side. Of this offense Buck was unwittingly guilty, and the first knowledge he had of this indiscretion was when Sol-leks whirled upon him and slashed his shoulder to the bone for 3 inches up and down. Forever after, Buck avoided his blind side, and to the last of their comradeship had no more trouble. His only apparent ambition, like Dave's, was to be left alone, though, as Buck was afterward to learn, each of them possessed one another and even more vital ambition. That night, Buck faced the great problem of sleeping. The tent, illumined by a candle, glowed warmly in the mist of the white plains, and when he was, as a matter of course, entered it, both Perlot and Francis bombarded him with curses and cooking utensils, till he recovered from his consternation and fled ignominiously into the outer cold. A chill wind was blowing that nipped him sharply, and bit with especial venom into his wounded shoulder. He lay down in the snow and attempted to sleep, but the frost soon drove him shivering to his feet. Miserable and disconsolate, he wandered about among the many tents, only to find that one place was as cold as another. Here and there savage dogs rushed upon him, but he bristled his neck hairs and snarled, for he was learning fast, and they let him go unmolested. Finally, an idea came to him. He would return to see how his own teammates were making out. To his astonishment, they had disappeared. Again, he wandered about through the great camp, looking for them, and again he returned. Were they in the tent? No, that would not be, else he would not have been driven out. Then where could they possibly be? With a droopy tail and a shivering body, very forlorn indeed, he aimlessly circled the tent. Suddenly the snow gave way beneath his forelegs, and he sank down. Something wriggled under his feet. He sprang back, bristling and snarling, fearful of the unseen and unknown. But a friendly little yelp reassured him, and he went back to investigate. A whiff of warm air ascended to his nostrils, and there, curled up under the snow in a snug ball, lay Billy. He whined placidly, squirming and wriggled to show his good will and intentions, and even ventured as a bribe for peace to lick Buck's face with its warm, wet tongue. Another lesson. So that was the way they did it, huh? Buck confidently selected a spot, and with much fuss and wasted effort, proceeded to dig a hole for himself. In a trice, the heat from the body filled the confined space, and he was asleep. The day had been long and audacious, and he slept soundly and comfortably, though he growled and barked and wrestled with bad dreams. Nor did he open his eyes till roused by the noises of the waking camp. At first he did not know where he was. It had snowed during the night, and he was completely buried. The snow walls pressed him on every side, and a great surge of fear swept through him, the fear of the wild thing for the trap. It was a token that he had hearkened back through his own life to the lives of his forebears. for he was a civilized dog, an unduly civilized dog. In his own experience knew no trap, and so could not for himself fear it. The muscles of his whole body contracted spasmodically and instinctively. The hair on his neck and shoulders stood on end, and with a ferocious snarl he bounded straight up into the blinding day, the snow flying about him in a flashing cloud ere he landed on his feet. He saw the white cap spread out before him, and knew where he was, and remembered all that had passed from the time he went from a stroll with Manuel to the hole he had dug for himself the night before. A shout from Francis hailed his appearance. "What I say?" the dog driver called to Perlot. "That buck for sure dare learn quick as anything." Perlot nodded gravely. As courier for the Canadian government, bearing important dispatches, he was anxious to secure the best dogs, and he was particularly gladdened by the possession of Buck. 3 more huskies were added to the team inside an hour, making a total of 9, and before another quarter of an hour had passed, they were in harness and swinging up the trail toward the Dea Canyon. Buck was glad to be gone, and though the work was hard, he found he did not particularly despise it. He was surprised at the eagerness which animated the whole team and which was communicated to him. But still more surprisingly was the change wrought in Dave and Sol-leks. They were new dogs, utterly transformed by the harness. All passiveness and unconcern had dropped from them. They were alert and active, anxious that the work should go well, and fiercely irritable with whatever, by delay of confusion, retarded that work. The toil of the traces seemed the supreme expression of their being, and all that they lived for, and the only thing in which they took delight. Dave was wheeler, or sled dog. Pulling in front of him was Buck. Then came Sol-leks. The rest of the team was strung out ahead, single file to the leader, which position was filled by Spitz. Buck had purposely placed between Dave and Sol-leks so that he might receive instruction. Apt scholar that he was, they were equally apt teachers, never allowing him to linger longer in error and enforcing their teaching with their sharp teeth. Dave was fair and very wise. He never nipped Buck without cause, and he never failed to nip him when he stood in need of it. And Francis' whip backed him up. Buck found it to be cheaper to mend his ways than to retaliate. Once during a brief halt when they got tangled in the traces and delayed the start, both Dave and Sol-leks flew at him and administered a sound trouncing. The result tangle was even worse, but Buck took good care to keep the traces clear thereafter, and the air of the day was done. So well had he mastered his work, his mates about ceased nagging him. Francis's whip snapped less frequently, and Perlot even honored Buck by lifting him up his feet and carefully examining them. It was a hard day's run up the canyon, through the sheep camp, past the scales and the timberline, across glaciers and snowdrifts, hundreds of feet deep, and over the great Chilliwack Divide, which stands between the salt water and the fresh and guards forbiddingly the sad and lonely north. They make good time down the chain of lakes which fills the craters of extinct volcanoes, and late that night pulled into a huge camp at the head of Lake Bennett, whose thousands of gold seekers were building boats against the breakup of the ice in the spring. Buck made his hole in the snow and slept the sleep of the exhausted just, but all too early was routed out in the coldness in the harness with his mates to the sled. That day they made 40 miles, the trail being packed, but the next day, and for many days to follow, they broke their own trail, worked harder, and made poorer time. As a rule, Perlot traveled ahead of them, packing the snow with a webbed shoes to make it easier for them. Francis guided the sled at the glee pole, sometimes exchanging places with him, but not often. Perlot was in a hurry, and he prided himself on his knowledge of ice, which knowledge was indispensable, for the fall ice was very thin, and where there was swift water there was no ice at all. Day after day, for days unending, Buck toiled in the traces. Always they broke camp in the dark, and the first gray of dawn found them hitting the trail with fresh miles reeled off behind them. And always they pitched camp after dark, eating their bit of fish and crawling to sleep into the snow. Buck was ravenous. The pound and a half of sun-dried salmon, which was his ration for each day, seemed to go nowhere. He never had enough, and suffered from perpetual hunger pains. Yet the other dogs, because they weighed less and were born to the life, received a pound only of the fish and managed to keep in good condition. He swiftly lost his fastidiousness, which was characterized his whole life. A dainty eater, he found that his mates finished first, robbed him of his unfinished rations. There was no defending it. While he was fighting off two or three, it was disappearing down the throats of others. To remedy this, he ate as fast as they, and so greatly did hunger compel him, he was not above taking what did not belong to him. He watched and learned. When he saw Pike, one of the new dogs, a clever mangler and thief, slyly steal a slice of bacon when Perlotte's back was turned, he duplicated the performance the following day, getting away with a whole chunk. A great uproar was raised, but he was unsuspected, while Dub, an awkward blunderer, who was always getting caught, was punished for Buck's misdeed. This first theft marked Buck as fit to survive in the hostile Northland environment. It marked his adaptability, his capability to adjust himself to changing conditions, the lack of which would have meant swift and terrible death. It marked further the decay of going to pieces for his moral nature, a vain thing and a handicap in the ruthless struggle for existence. It was all well enough in the Southland, under the laws of love and fellowship, to respect private property and personal feelings, but in the Northland, under the law of the club and flang, whoso took such things into account was a fool, and in so far as he observed, he would fail to prosper. Now that Buck reasoned it out, he was fit. That was all. Unconsciously, he accommodated himself to the new mode of life. All his days, no matter what the odds, he had never run from a fight, but the club of the man in the red sweater had beaten into him more fundamental and primitive code. Civilized, he could have died for a moral consideration, say the defense of Judge Miller's riding whip, but the completeness of his decivilization was now evidenced by his ability to flee from the defense of a moral consideration and to save his hide. He did not steal for joy of it, but because the clamor of his stomach. He did not rob openly, but stole secretly and cunningly, out of respect for the club and Fang. In short, the things he did were done because it was easier to do them than not to do them. His development was rapid. His muscles became hard as iron, and he grew callous to ordinary pain. He achieved an internal as well as external economy. He could eat anything, no matter how loathsome or indigestible, and once eaten, the juices of his stomach extracted the least particle of nutrients, and his blood carried it to the farthest reaches of his body, building it into the toughest and stoutest of tissues. Sight and scent became remarkably keen, while his hearing developed such acuteness that in his sleep he heard the faintest sound and knew whether it heralded peace or peril. He learned to bite the ice out with his teeth when it was collecting between his toes, and when he was thirsty and there was a thick scum of ice over the waterhole, he would break it by rearing and striking it with his own stiff, sore legs. His most conspicuous trait was an ability to scent the wind and forecast it at night in advance. No matter how breathless the air when he dug his nest by the tree or bank, the wind that later blew inevitably found him to leeward, sheltered and snug. And not only did he learn by experience, but instincts long dead became alive again. The domesticated generations fell from him. In vague ways he remembered back to his youth of the breed, to the time the wild dogs ranged in packs through the primitive forest and killed the meat as they ran it down. It was no task for him to learn to fight with a cut and a slash and a quick wolf snap, in the manner he had fought forgotten ancestors. They quickened the old life within him, and the old tricks which had stamped into the heredity of the breed were his tricks. They came to him without effort or discovery, as though they had always been there. And when on the still cold nights he pointed his nose at the star and howled long and wolf-like, it was his ancestors, dead and dust, pointing nose at the star and howling down through the centuries and through him. And his cadences were their cadences, and cadences which voiced their woe and what to them was the meaning of the stillness and the cold and the dark. Thus, as token of what a puppet thing life is, the ancient song surged through him, and he came into his own again. And he came because men had found a yellow metal in the north, and because Manuel was a gardener's helper whose wages did not lap over the needs of his wife and divers small copies of himself. That ends chapter 2. Tune in tomorrow for Chapter 3.